Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. We are excited to offer 2 starting levels of professional trainings designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is a psychoeducational training designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. The Level 2 NARM Therapist training is a comprehensive clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, as well as current mental health graduate students and clinical interns and trainees. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. From its inception in January 2020, the Transforming Trauma podcast has been dedicated to bringing trauma-informed work to individuals, families, and communities with the intention of making this work more accessible. 100 episodes later, we're excited to celebrate the map for increased resiliency, greater health outcomes, healthier relationships, personal growth, and social change created by the podcast and its incredible guests. The NARM Training Institute and the Transforming Trauma team are proud to have reached listeners in 92 countries with almost 500,000 downloads. The podcast continues to be in the top 10 of the mental health and trauma categories. Today, we're excited to have Chloé Valdary as our special guest for this milestone episode. Chloé is a public educator and lecturer who teaches a program called the Theory of Enchantment to students, administrators, and educators at high schools and college campuses across the U.S. The program, which aims to teach young people a framework for healthy identity formation, is rooted in the study of classic literature and philosophy, alongside cartoons, ad campaigns, the music of Beyoncé, and the porous borders where universal narratives merge with contemporary pop culture. She also hosts the Theory of Enchantment podcast, where she holds conversations with artists, musicians, and authors, as well as business owners and community organizers. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and Commentary. Please enjoy this conversation with Chloé Valdary and Brad Kammer.
Hi, Chloé. Welcome to Transforming Trauma. I'm so excited to have you on here with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, well, I was telling you before, I'm a huge fan of your work. I've been following you for a while now. I've watched a lot of videos and podcasts, and our Training Institute staff has all been trained in the Theory of Enchantment. So I have just tons of questions for you. And I feel like this is just a huge honor for me to get to know you. And thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Well, let's start. Folks might not know who you are. So let's just share who you are, what you're doing, and anything you'd like people to know about you.
So my name is Chloé Valdary. I live in New York. I'm originally from New Orleans. And about 4 years ago, actually, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, what is time? I created an organization called Theory of Enchantment, which basically provides an anti-racism curriculum, pedagogy that teaches people how to get in right relationship with themselves. Fundamentally, that's the core of the program. And the idea is that if people are able to get in a right relationship with themselves, be in a healthy relationship with themselves, they'll be less likely to project their insecurities onto others, which is, we believe, the seed of supremacist sort of tendencies within a human being. And so in our curriculum, the curriculum is roughly 25 lessons. And in the curriculum, we use pop culture to teach people different tools, or to give people different tools to get in right relationship with themselves. So, for example, we might introduce Stoicism as a kind of psychotechnology. We'll talk about the Lion King, because the Lion King actually surfaces some of those Stoic principles that we may have associated only with Marcus Aurelius or only with ancient times. So we really believe in bringing in ancient pop culture, if you will, to be in conversation with contemporary pop culture, to demonstrate the common thread of wisdom and how it never ceases no matter what time period you're living in. So it's basically timeless. But that's the essence of what we do. And we provide this curriculum to corporations, schools, really anyone who might be interested.
Yeah, when I was, studying the theory of enchantment, my kids gave me a lot of cred because I was talking about Kendrick Lamar and and
Nice.
some of the I was quoting a few lines that was giving me some nice cred with them, but it was so useful the way because I like to teach like that too. How do we make it directly accessible? Because like you said, these classical theorists from 2,000 years ago don't make the work so accessible. Even psychology, a lot of psychological literature. I know that you're like me, you're passionate about learning all Jung work and all this, all the depth psychology, but it's hard to kind of conceptualize. So the way that you've digested it and sharing it is so useful.
I'm so happy to hear that. I really love hearing, especially from people, like directly from people who have engaged with the curriculum. So I'm so curious to learn how it's landed for you and how it's alive for you in your own relationships.
Well, we're going to talk more about that, I hope, because I want to talk a little bit about the three principles and the three kind of organizing principles of theory of enchantment. But first, let's get a little bit more into like, how did you get into this field? I was mentioning like something I learned about you about your growing up and being introduced to Judaism. And I'm just interested in like how you got to where you are now, as much as you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah. So I grew up, like I said, in New Orleans. I was a part of a Christian church family that observed many Jewish holidays. The most closest comp for this is Seventh-day Adventist. So Seventh-day Adventist is a small denomination of Christians who observe the seventh day. So they go to church on Saturday instead of Sunday. The church that I grew up in did the same thing. We also didn't eat pork or shellfish. We also observed things like Rosh Hashanah, events like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, as opposed to Christmas or Easter. The rationale being that the founder of Christianity, Jesus, was observant of all of these different rituals. And that gave me a couple of different, I would say, insights or orientations and relationships to the world. The first is that it gave me a historical scope and a lens on the world. Even though I was born and raised in New Orleans, every Christmas I'd spend reading about Emperor Constantine and the works of Emperor Constantine. And so that gave me a sense of historical time and the impact that the past has had on the present, which is totally, I think, deeply impacted the way I move about in the world and the way I relate to different rituals and things like that. The other way in which it impacted me was that it made me extremely allergic to anti-Semitism and really wanting to pursue some sort of way to combat it, which is really like what Theory of Enchantment grew out of. So in my allergic reaction to anti-Semitism in the late years of my high school and more in college, I started becoming involved in things like, the Jewish Culture Club in my high school. And then in college, I majored in international studies, specifically to focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I had a pro-Israel club. And I did all these, hosted all these events and brought speakers and learned about the Israeli political sort of landscape, if you will. But I, throughout that experience, learned many things, had many successes, but also many failures. And one of the failures or opportunities for growth that I had was this realization that an approach to combating conflict that's only rooted in a political approach is not going to work. And the reason for that is because for whatever reason, the political system today is very much incentivizing us versus them thinking, very much incentivizing polarization. And so I was reading books and interfacing with ways of thinking that perpetuated this, even though they were all coming from a really good place, ultimately trying to combat anti-Semitism. It wasn't until I started reading Israeli literature, and I want to stress the difference between literature and, polemical works or political works for a second. Israeli literature specifically and literature in general tends to empathize and humanize human beings, right? Characters in the story, people that are a part of a community. And when I started to read Israeli literature, that's what really started to humanize both Israelis and Palestinians. And it gave me a different language with which I could try to address the problem of anti-Semitism and what would later become a focus on combating bigotry of all kinds. And so at this point in my life, this is like 2015, I've just graduated from college. I've moved to New York. I'm at the Wall Street Journal, and I'm working on a thesis, still trying to figure out how to combat anti-Semitism. But that question has shifted to actually, how do you get people to love, let's say, Israelis, with a specific focus on the word love? Because that was something else that was absent from the scholarship that I received in college. My concentration was in conflict and diplomacy. So you would think that there would be a focus on love in order to combat conflict, but there wasn't. And so I tried to ask this question, well, how do you teach people how to love? And that's when I started to ask myself, well, what are people already in love with? Oh, they're already in love with pop culture. Maybe if I study pop culture, different sources in pop culture, Disney, Nike, Apple, all these brands that have, religious like devotion from their fans, maybe I can learn something about the psychology of love. And so that's what I did. I started studying all of these pop culture brands, and I noticed that the common thread was that all these pop culture brands, the way they marketed content or created content was they reflected the human being, her imperfections, her insecurities, her complexity, and her potential. And it was very aspirational. And this is what caused us as human beings to buy into these brands. And I found that fundamentally enchanting, which is why I sort of landed on the word enchantment. It's also a word that's associated with things like Disney already. And Steve Jobs, when he was designing Apple products, actually used this term to describe the process by which you delight people. So I was like, basically, really in the laboratory of ideas. And it was out of this desire to fight anti-Semitism, specifically and more broadly, fight against bigotry, that I landed upon this sort of concept of enchantment. And from there, after I wrote this thesis on this concept, I started to tease it out. So I worked for a nonprofit for 2 years. And it was during this time that I developed the 3 principles of the theory of enchantment. And those 3 principles are, number 1, treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. Number 2, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy. And number 3, try to root everything you do in love and compassion. So those were the 3 principles, and I was lecturing in many different universities on these 3 principles and specifically applying them to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So after I did that for 2 years, I was wondering what to do next. At this point, I was on my own. I decided to create an LLC, and some advice that I received from people was to turn those 3 principles into a curriculum. And that's where I started building the curriculum, started bringing in the different pop culture references that really underpin each of those principles. So, for example, you mentioned Kendrick Lamar. We situate Kendrick Lamar's commentary on the human condition in his song DNA as part of teaching the first principle, treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. So in the song DNA, he says, I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA. And we actually use that to get people to wrestle with the complexity of what it means to be a human being. Because if we say treat people like human beings, the logical next question becomes, well, what does it actually mean to be a human being? How do you grapple with that? How do you make sense of that? So that's sort of a 10,000-foot overview of the timeline from the end of high school until the creation of the Theory of Enchantment curriculum.
Super inspiring and interesting, this journey. I tell the story in my teaching about when I first, because I taught for many years in college and graduate programs in psychology. The first time I was about to teach, I got the textbook and, 600-page textbook for Psych 101. And I went through it and there was not one mention of love in the whole book. 600 pages about human psychology and there wasn't a mention of love. And I was like, wow, we have come so far. And it seems like you're bringing love, you're centering back on love, which I know you quote a lot Martin Luther King's work, and how far the social justice movement has gotten in many ways from centering it around love and connection and compassion.
That's an interesting observation. I think that love has always been hard and rare. Certainly as a part of social justice movements. In many ways, the civil rights movement was a kind of exception to the long history of social justice movements throughout human history, not just within an American context. It's very rare to find a political movement that is centered on love. Even Dr. King said that the aim and ideal of the civil rights movement, it wasn't the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it was agape love. The purpose, the ultimate purpose of the civil rights movement and the organizing that happened in the civil rights movement was to actually create a beloved community within the American landscape that could achieve real integration. And unfortunately, that didn't happen, which isn't to say that we should be dismissive of the great inroads that we made legally. But in some ways, it's actually harder to produce the social cultural aspects of what was attempted in the civil rights movement than it is to produce the legal aspects or the legal outcomes. What's tricky about that is that the legal outcomes cannot be sustained without that social cultural milieu on the ground. So I would say on the one hand, you could look at it as the social justice movements have strayed away. But the truth is that it's very rare. In my limited knowledge, in my ignorance, I can only really count a handful of different social justice movements throughout human history that really focused on this specific quality of love as being the center of its organizing.
I've always believed that true social and political work has to start inside out. And it seems like this is just so aligned with your work, because even in the work that as part of the NARM Training Institute that we do is about differentiating between behavioral change and actually internal state change. And a lot of what you've integrated into your work is about depth psychology. I know that's a lot of your thinking and what you're excited about. At least I follow your Twitter and stuff. And so much of, psychology has moved really far away from that in many ways. Everything is very kind of behavioral change, symptom oriented. And you can quiet a symptom, but it doesn't necessarily change the disorganization on a deeper level. And that's what I kind of hear you saying. It's like there's a lot of political changes we can make, but until we actually change people's hearts and how they're driven from their hearts. And I wanted to ask you a specific question, because one of the things that we talk a lot about in our work, our work is focused on complex trauma, which is like developmental trauma, attachment trauma, and also larger like intergenerational trauma. And one of the things we talk a lot about for children that grow up where there's like failures in their environment, whether that's from their immediate family or whether it's cultural issues or intergenerational issues that get passed down, that children have to like disconnect from their hearts. Like it's a survival mechanism of disconnecting from their hearts. And our model is really about how to help people to reconnect to their hearts, even when the outside environment's not creating the safety
that's hard
for them to do that. Yeah. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Just does that align for your thinking?
You're definitely more of an expert when it comes to childhood development. So that particular topic is not something I can say that I know much about. But generally speaking, I think that what we are trying to do is help people create that sense of internal safety and give people the tools to cultivate a sense of internal safety, even if, in their surrounding environment, there is that scarcity. And the reason for that is because the way we trace back supremacist manifestations, which is basically simply thinking that you're better than another human being. And it could be because of X, Y, or Z, right? It could be because of race. It could be because of gender, but it could also be because of political party, right? It could be because of anything. But we trace the seed of that back to a person experiencing some kind of scarcity, oftentimes both material and psychological, but really emphasizing the psychological piece here. It's oftentimes someone experiencing a sense of a lack of belonging. And because they don't have the tools to deal with that, they might overcompensate by adopting a heuristic of, simply put, all the people who look like me are good and all the people who don't look like me are bad. So in that sense, it is a defensive mechanism to deal with a feeling of scarcity. And so if our hypothesis is that if we could give people a tool of practices that can provide them with a sense of security, even in the midst of insecurity, they will be less likely to do that. And I want to tease out this concept of love for a second, because I think it might be useful. One of the things that we're really trying to, I guess, implement in, you could say, Theory of Enchantment 2.0 is the inclusion of more somatic experiences, especially meditation and contemplation exercises. So we're working with a brilliant cognitive scientist named John Vervaeke, who's providing us with meditation modules. And the purpose of these modules, in addition to or in tandem with a lot of the other pieces that we have in Theory of Enchantment, is basically to get the person or the participant to start expressing unconditional love to every aspect of their being. And not just every aspect of their being, right? Not just every quality or lack of quality in their character, but also for every situation, every quality that emerges out of a given situation. So yesterday, for example, there was like a drop in my energy around 1 p.m. my time. And in the past, my mind, when I feel this drop in my energy, my mind feels almost resentful, or like I want to get out of this state. I want to hurry through this state. I want to completely try to bypass this state so I can get to a level of excitement or just greater energy. But now that I've been practicing Theory of Enchantment for a few years, my tendency is slowly but surely, not completely, but it's slowly but surely becoming the capacity to simply feel whatever state I'm in, to fully feel it as a quality of what it means to be alive, and to simply be aware of it, and to practice awareness in relationship to it. And I have found that this is very critical. This basic practice is very critical because it over time will teach you unconditional love. What you're doing when you enter into that practice is you are practicing love without conditions, love in spite of whatever the external or internal conditions you're experiencing. And also an awareness that whatever sensation you're feeling, whether it's painful or pleasant, that this is simply sensation. This is just the oscillation of energy moving through you and within you. And so in that sense, it doesn't have to be personal, and it doesn't have to be something that you necessarily want to skip over or move through so quickly. And I find that the metaphor of a mother holding her child is very useful to sort of visualize when trying to think of what the concept of unconditional love means. Because ideally, the type of love that a mother shows to her child is precisely that love. The capacity to love the child when the child is crying, when the child is happy, when the child is joyful, when the child is bored. Like all of the different aspects that a child is experiencing, a mother's capacity to show that child unconditional love is precisely what we're trying to exact for ourselves in any given situation.
Yeah. One of the things that I heard you saying at the beginning of what you were sharing is about this splitting. We talk about in psychology as splittings, and then the shadow that comes out of when we split and we're not aware of a side of us, an unconscious side of us. So you want to talk more about that specifically, that part of it?
Yeah, sure. So in Theory of Enchantment's workshops, we explicitly talk about racism as a form of splitting. And we say it is this heuristic that our minds can go into unconsciously as a result of feeling a lack of order and security within our world. And in order to grab onto something that seems secure and seems very constant, we simply split the world in black and white, both literally and figuratively. And again, we say that all these people over here who look like me or who are familiar to me are good, and those who are unfamiliar are bad. And that goes back to like a misapprehension of how to relate to the unknown, which is a perennial problem of the human condition, right? Yeah. So this is in essence what we're dealing with. So it's funny and awesome that you brought up splitting, because specifically in the 90-minute workshop that Theory of Enchantment offers for organizations, we talk about that. We talk about how, Dr. King called the United States a deeply schizophrenic society precisely because he was able to connect racism to splitting. And so in this way, we sort of give a psychological context for it, but we also demystify supremacy because at the end of the day, anyone is capable of it. And as much as we don't want to encourage people to associate Blackness with the devil, we also don't want people to associate whiteness with the devil, right? Both are forms of splitting. And a symbol from a wisdom tradition I love, which is Taoism, is the yin-yang sign. And we offer up this symbol as a symbol of integration because in the yin-yang sign, you see there's a little bit of black and white, there's a little bit of white and black. These two concepts, these two ideas of darkness and light actually depend upon each other to exist. The one cannot exist without the other. So we try to sort of give people different, I guess, anchoring so that they can see how splitting is a kind of misfire or self-deception that we as human beings can get into when we're trying to grasp for control or when we're trying to grasp for something through which we can feel secure.
It's amazing how many personal interests you and I share because Taoism has been a very strong influence for me as well. And it
cool.
just, I love the nature wisdom of it. It's so simple in how they use their metaphors of nature to help teach us these very deep lessons that many spiritual and religious traditions use way too many words to describe. And really, it's just a direct feeling of it. And one of the things I was hearing you say that you didn't name, but I know you've talked about this in other places, is about this relationship between superiority complex and inferiority complex. I wonder if you'd be able to expand a little bit about how you talk about that in terms of the splitting and the shadow. And
yeah, so in the sense that, opposites depend upon each other to exist, usually when someone is acting out of a superiority complex, it's usually a facade, meaning the outward manifestation, which is to say that if a person is walking around, expressing that they're better than other people or existentially superior to other people, you can bet that there's an inferiority complex within. And that's what Jung called the shadow, sort of the shadow part of the self. And it's the unconscious parts of the self. And basically what happens is if we aren't in right relationship with, our insecurities, and in this case, it's usually someone who is feeling actually incredibly a lack of worth or worthiness. And so that person overcompensates by saying, I'm better than you, or I'm, superior to you. And what happens in our society is that we respond to the facade instead of responding to what's actually going on. And when we do that, we increase the possibility that the person will actually become even more fallen into that superiority or supremacist ideology. Because if we were to realize that a person who is acting in that way deep down feels deeply wounded, in fact, and deeply worthless, then we wouldn't respond, I hope. We wouldn't respond by doubling down and being like, actually, you are worthless, right? Because that type of rhetoric is more likely to produce the supremacist ideology in the first place. We've seen this oftentimes, these anecdotal yet powerful testimonies of people who have gravitated to white supremacist organizations. There's oftentimes, you see these men have in their past lives, or even in their experiences with these organizations, many times tried to commit self-harm. And it's like, if you are feeling like you're this big and bad person, that you got it going on, why would you try to commit self-harm, right? There's something clearly off. The internal state and the external behavior really isn't matching the rhetoric that's coming out of the person's mouth. And so if we could train ourselves to see what's happening within, then we might be able to build better systems that could respond to what's happening within. But if we're blinded by the projection, because this person is feeling oftentimes worthless, and then they project that feeling of worthlessness onto people who don't look like them by saying, no, you're worthless, right? Mm-hmm. If we could not be fooled by that misdirection and actually return to the source, then perhaps we'd be able to come up with better solutions in the long run.
In the NARM work, we talk about pride-based identifications and shame-based identifications, which is the pride-based is always emerging out of the shame-based that, like you said, like we're on a deep level, we internalize the failures of our early life and we make them personal.
Yeah.
And then some people stay stuck in that, but often people actually develop these, like the false self, the pride-based strategies. And that's what we, like you said, that we end up responding to instead of really holding space for what's underneath it, which is really where the healing has to happen.
Yeah. It's very scary to go there.
Yeah.
It's very scary to go to the place underneath. But I really don't see any alternative at this point in the life of our species. Also, it's funny that you brought up pride and shame. One of my favorite shows is Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I don't know if you've seen this show. If you haven't, it's so good. I believe it's on Netflix if you want to check it out. I think it's actually probably one of the best children's shows ever made. But there's this scene between this character, Uncle Iroh, and his nephew. And his nephew is having a bad moment where he's like consumed by pride. And Uncle Iroh is this like brilliant, wise person. He's like, you don't have to be ashamed. And then his nephew goes, I'm not ashamed. I'm proud. Why would I be ashamed? And then Uncle Iroh goes, pride is not the opposite of shame, but the source of it. And it's this brilliant like through line that he makes that really encapsulates what you just said. So, yeah.
Oh, I love that. That's great. I'll have to check that out. It sounds interesting and fun. I mean, this topic of shame leads us into something that I'm interested in about, and I'm guessing it plays out a lot in organizations that want to bring you in, but just what it's kind of grouped under this category of cancel culture. And, I like hearing people's perspectives on how, because people have a lot of different terms for it. They'll call it accountability culture. I heard it called council culture recently. I'm just curious, how do you hold it based on the theory of enchantment in your work?
Cancel culture is one of these things where I feel like in 2000 and let's say from 2014 to 2016, I knew what people meant by cancel culture. Like people were, professors were having their tenure denied and were being really attacked or shouted down for having opinions that were unpopular. And so I could see how cancel culture was what it meant in that context. But I think like post 2020, it's become this term that so many people utilize to mean everything from disagreement to actually some of those other examples that I just pointed out. It's weird. These terms take on a life of their own. But I will say in general that oftentimes at least for the ways in which the negative associations that I have, or the real associations that I have with cancel culture, that's often like a failure to deal with the shadow, but on a societal level, as opposed to the individual level. So, I can't think of a primary example off the top of my head, but let's call it, broadly speaking, the left-wing tendency to cancel Trump supporters. And by cancel Trump supporters, I'm actually going to use the word cancel to mean, broadly speaking, to disparage and look down upon Trump supporters, right? That represents, in my mind, a failure to understand or to reconcile with the part of themselves that is the Trump supporter. And I don't mean like literally supporting Trump, but the person within who has the tendency to, when beset by insecurity, reach for a dogmatic position or a strong man, or, which is within all of us as human beings. And at the same time, I would say that the feverish attempt on the part of the right to cancel any conversation about critical race theory, for example, is similarly a kind of rejection of their own tendency, because, not to tease this out in such a long way, but the elements of critical race theory that many Republicans or folks on the right disagree with represent an overreach in authority, essentially, and an attempt to exert absolute control for the purpose of trying to create certain outcomes. But in the desire to cancel critical race theory, let's say, with removing it from curricula, lies that same tendency to try to exact control so that you can pursue outcomes. So one is the reflection of the other. And yeah, so in that sense, I think cancel culture is a failure on the collective level, on the societal level of all of us to do shadow work, to do necessary shadow work. And it's not helped by, social media platforms like Twitter that grab our attention by promoting some of these tendencies in the first place.
Yeah, I just think about the role shame plays in all of this. And it's like very early in my career, I worked with this guy who had gotten out of prison and he had had sexual offenses of a minor. And you have to go back to where you were based on, probation sends you back to the community that you lived in. So he was going back to the community and struggling because he was now an outcast, which makes complete sense on one level. But on another level, he had done his time. He had gotten clean in prison, and he had done what he needed to do to try to rehabilitate himself. And he already felt his own internal shame about his transgressions that he had learned more about. And now he couldn't find belonging in a community. And I just think about this as we're so quick to like cancel people, and just like what the all the different impacts of that are. And I don't have a solution for anything, but just thinking about both the personal and the collective impact about becoming a society that's so quick, like you said, both on the right and left, to just go after things in such a personal way. Like, how are we supposed to rehabilitate? How are we supposed to learn if everything is so high stakes for people?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is very human, all of these tendencies on our part to cancel each other, because ultimately we're afraid to look at the pieces of ourselves that we are ashamed of. And so in order to deal with that fear, I think we reach for this act of canceling, which is another example of the splitting heuristic.
Yeah.
And it's hard because when you're crafting social policy, you obviously want to protect society from others who would do them harm. But at the same time, I think there are ways to build that without the punitive mentality that we have, which is quite frankly a product of the longstanding aspects of Protestantism and things of that nature that are part of the soil of American identity, really. And so if we want to overcome that, or we want to sort of work through that, that's going to take hundreds of years.
One step at a time, I guess. Yeah.
I think it's worth it, but just trying to be realistic, that's the punitive, there's a reason why, Scarlet Letter is a book that you read. I mean, at least I read it in 10th grade. It's a part of the puritanical lineage of what it means to be an American. And that has to be wrestled with and confronted and transmuted if we want to move in a different direction, say, Finland's justice system, which looks very different than the way it looks here in America.
Yeah. It seems like this leads us back to the three principles of the theory of enchantment, which the first one is about treating people like humans and not as political abstractions. And for me, that was the first thing that when I started looking into the theory of enchantment, that just so captivated me, because I shared with you just before we start a little bit, but in some way, my journey got really clarified and more confusing for me as I got deeper into intergenerational trauma, and this movement around social justice and around BIPOC was getting stronger, maybe 10 years ago. And I remember after a training, I was being called a white male, and I went back to my hotel room and I Googled, are Jews white?
Yeah.
It was so confusing to me. It's people were grouping me into my own oppressors.
Yeah.
And it was so deeply objectifying, not giving me a chance to respond, because immediately I was just, this is what I was. And it felt so dehumanizing. I mean, I can feel it even as I'm talking about it, all the charge I have with it still. And it was so good that this was happening to me, though, because it really sent me on this deeper dive of understanding that, from my perspective, any kind of work that is going to be successful on a social or political level has to start with this basic principle that we're all humans. And yes, we have identities that are very important to us, and those identities can be both helpful and harmful. But underneath that is really just this sense of shared humanity. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more from your perspective about like where that emerged from and how central that is to your model.
When I hear you speaking, I think a lot about how, especially in 2020, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter, and so much conversation around race happening in this country, I feel like I was just like feverishly reading, but like I was reading very specific texts. You know, I was reading Reinhold Niebuhr's work, who's this theologian from the 19th century who deeply influenced Dr. King. And I started, and, you know, Jung, of course, as well, but I started to get into Eastern metaphysics in my studies. And this is another situation in which I think a contact with Eastern metaphysics would be useful for us here in America, because within the system, certainly within, let's say, Taoism and elements of Buddhism as well, there's this idea that like there is no singular, perpetually defined self. The self is an illusion. Let me clarify. The self as a consistent entity is an illusion. It changes depending upon the context and the roles that we adopt, and it's constantly transforming. And this is a part of the inexhaustibility of what it means to be a human being, and that which goes back to the first principle. And so I think that the way in which the phenomenon that you just described, whereby, you know, you're put into this box, that is simply a part, unfortunately, or, you know, it is what it is. It's a part of our lineage, I think, within the West specifically, which has constantly tried to objectify the self.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an irony here, because I don't know if you know this, but in 2020, the African American Heritage Museum in DC put out this statement decrying certain things as whiteness. And one of the things that they said was a function of whiteness was objectification, which in and of itself is an act of objectification, right? To make that statement. It's like, I do think as a country, we are grappling with deep existential issues, but we're not quite there, and we don't quite have the tools. But hopefully, you know, that's changing, and Theory of Enchantment can contribute to it. Your practice can contribute to it. But like, there are so many aspects of how we talk about race that have nothing to do with race per se, but have to do with our need to cling to certain aspects of our identity in order to have a sense of security. And you can see how it becomes splitting all the way down. And that goes centuries back. That tendency to split in that way, at least within the West, goes centuries and centuries back in Western history. And if any of you are interested in learning more about this, I would highly recommend the podcast Awakening from the Meaning Crisis by John Vervaeke. He goes through the whole thing. It's amazing. But yeah, that tendency to box people in, because when you're stereotyping someone, you're simultaneously stereotyping yourself. If I'm saying that you're an oppressor, I'm denying the fact that in other contexts, I could very well be oppressing other people. It could be unconscious, but like, I'm denying the fact that I'm even capable of being in that role, let alone assuming that role. If I call another group of people lazy because of their skin color, I'm denying the fact that in some contexts, I'm lazy. So we don't realize that when we take up these roles, when we project stereotypes onto others, we're simultaneously stereotyping ourselves. But in order to realize that, one has to adopt an ecology of practices and a discipline so that they can guard themselves against self-deception, which we are perennially susceptible to.
Okay, so this leads to the second principle about criticizing to uplift and not to disempower or, you know, attack. And I'm curious, even that word that you started with, like criticize, and just the thinking behind that. And what does that actually mean? Let's unpack that.
It's related to something we talked about earlier. If you can acknowledge that someone who's, let's say, caught up in supremacist ideology is deeply in pain, then you can criticize what they're doing while also being able to acknowledge the pain that they're encountering, perhaps the pain of feeling worthless, for example, you have to be able to show that person and tell that person that you care about them. Because what's happening is that the white nationalist organization is telling them that they care about them. And is telling them that they will give them a sense of pride and give them something to believe in and give them something that will make them feel worthy, which is what we as human beings want. Because one of the basic needs that we have is that sense of belonging. So if you just criticize that person, but in criticizing them, you call them a piece of crap, then you've actually done a disservice to the outcome that you're actually going for. So if you criticize them, but you don't actually care about them, then what is the purpose of you criticizing them? Like, do you want them to change? If you want them to change, then you have to believe in their potential to change in the first place.
Exactly.
So that's really the rationale behind the second principle.
Yeah, it's great that you're saying this because we have a core principle and it's a skill in our NARM work that's called reinforcing agency. And agency is like a whole spectrum. And on the far end of the spectrum, it's confrontation. It's like someone is nailing a nail into their thumb and they just keep on telling you how much pain they're in. And you're like, dude, you're nailing your thumb. Like, why don't you stop doing that? It's going to be painful. I mean, we don't do it quite like that, but that's the idea of like helping people see the way that they're relating to themselves, that they have a blind spot or they're disconnected from. And our job out of compassion and care for them, because therapy has gone in this direction where it's so much caretaking, and there's a level of it that's really important to have empathy, but we call it unmanaged empathy when it goes too far. And it's like you're just trying to take care of people's strategies instead of actually where the source of the change is we can really support. So it just seems like that's so aligned with our clinical model too.
That makes a lot of sense. I would define that as like going into unmanaged empathy. Is that what you call it?
Mm-hmm.
That's like too much yin energy without the yang.
Exactly.
And going into the opposite side is like too much yang energy without the yin. And you need to have a balance.
Which is where psychology used to be. Psychotherapy, psychoanalysis used to be way too much of the yang and not enough of the yin. So this leads us to the last question. And I don't expect you to give me a full answer for this, but how to love? How do we bring that last principle in? How do we root everything in love and compassion for people that will want to embrace and embody these principles? How do we start this?
Well, so love is not a proposition, meaning it's not like a definition that you memorize. It's a way of being. It's a practice. It's a discipline. And so if you really want to enter into the practice of love, this goes back to what I said earlier, is you have to commit to adopting an ecology of practices that will help you gain new ways of seeing, new ways of relating to yourself, and therefore new ways of relating to the world. There is no substitute for practice. And I think that's really what we're trying to emphasize. 2023, Theory of Enchantment, it's a practice. And I can tell you that like I have my own practice that came out of my relationship with Theory of Enchantment. I also think that like practices will look different depending upon who we're talking about. But Theory of Enchantment is a kind of starting ground for people who might want to develop their own practices. But I would say, think to yourself, not what type of definitions do I need to memorize in order to love, because that is our tendency as a culture.
Yeah.
What definitions do I need to like memorize? What habits do I need to adopt in order to love? That is the central question. Theory of Enchantment can be a repository for this. I mentioned John Vervaeke, who's also a source and a great mentor, but look for a habit change and try to align your life accordingly.
Wow. Well, I could take your time all day and for the rest of the week, but I want to be respectful of your time. I'm just so happy that we got a chance to connect. Like I said, I've been a big fan of your work, and I think you're contributing something really important at this time of our evolution. I hope you're getting the support you need, because I know it's hard. I mean, there's a lot of obstacles along the way. And I hope there might be future collaboration or at least conversations between us.
That'd be cool, yeah.
I'd love to connect more. And so for folks that are listening that want to learn more about you and about your work, where should we point them to?
Yeah, thank you, Brett. I would say to people, if they're interested, check out theoryofenchantment.com. They can find the curriculum on our website. If they're interested in following along on social media, moderate your social media time. Let me just say that in advance. But you can also follow us at Theory of Enchantment on Instagram or at Enchant Theory on Twitter. But again, be responsible with the time that you spend on social media. Make sure it's not an addiction. Make sure it's just in moderation.
That's another practice too, practicing moderation.
That's a practice, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing with our community, and best to you as you continue with where you're going, and I'm looking forward to following you as you do that. So thank you.
Thank you. You as well, Brad. And I'd like to be in conversation and learn more from your practice as well. I look forward to that opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Are you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma? If so, we invite you to consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model in support of trauma-informed care. We are excited to offer psychoeducational and clinical trainings for a variety of mental health professionals. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.